Okay, so our next speaker is Kevin Stokesbury, and he is a professor of fisheries oceanography at the UMass Dartmouth School of Science and Technology.
So what I'm going to present is an overview of some of the work here we've been doing at SMAS with Vineyard Wind. And just as a bit of background, Vineyard Wind is the first wind company that's really going to be on a large scale putting turbines in the water. They, of course, there's the Block Island development and some other small ones, but this is a large effort, and it's one of the first ones to develop in the Massachusetts area. So when they started, Vineyard Wind came to us, and working with the university and my colleagues who are listed here, they asked us to put together an environmental assessment plan. And they really wanted to interact with the fishing industries in New England, and SMAS has a very strong reputation for working collaboratively with fishing industries. That's where most of my work is, with the scallop industry. And so we did that, and that effort was really led by Dr. Steve Cadron. So if I could have the next slide, please. Or am I, oh, wait a minute, I'm advancing it. Am I?
You should have control of the slides. Yes.
There we go. Okay, I went too fast. Oh, here, hold on a sec. Can I go back? Yeah. Okay, that's great. As a background, we looked at, so what we did, what Steve did particularly, he formed a working committee, and we went around and had interviews in all the local communities or several local communities along the Massachusetts coastline, talking to fishermen and their concerns. And we presented the information that was already known and underway, and tried to hear what their concerns were, and then also what the regulators were. So from those series of meetings, and I'm trying to, there we go. We ended up proposing doing four surveys, a benthic survey, a trawl survey, trap survey, and a plankton survey. And then we also suggested a number of supplementary studies that should be going on as well. So for the rest of the talk, what I'm going to show you is a bit of information on each of those four surveys that we have going. And then I'm going to expand it to some of the other work, which is on a more regional base that's going on here. Okay. It's not advancing. Hold on a second. Let's see if there we go. So the first survey that I'll talk about is this groundfish survey. Groundfish. Now, just as a little further background, remember the fishing industry is an old historic fishery here, but it's very vibrant. It provides a huge number of jobs. In fact, 35,000 just in New Bedford, in the port of New Bedford. New Bedford is the #1 fishing port in the United States by value. A lot of that's driven by the scallop fishery, which is worth about $500 million in harvest each year. And that is augmented by about a factor of 7 when you look at the spin-offs through all the community and stuff. Similarly, lobster is also worth about $500 million. So these are very large, very productive fisheries. So here, the first one we took a look at was the groundfish. Now, some people hear the groundfish in New England are struggling, and a few species are, but in fact, many of the species, the management plans, it's an extremely well-run fishing industry, and many of the stocks have completely recovered or on their way to recovering. And one of the things that you have to remember in dealing with the development of offshore energy and offshore wind and the fishing industry is that the fishing industry is used to a very high level of scrutiny and a high level of scientific information. So the, whoa, what's going on here? Oh, there we go. So the first survey here is a trawl survey, and that is linked in the next three surveys, they're all linked into larger sampling efforts. What we did was we designed a before-after control impacts study. So we looked at the area where vineyard wind was going to develop, and we selected an area similar to it that has the same kind of oceanographic conditions and hopefully the same marine community structure. And the idea is that if you monitor these before, during, and after the development, you can phase out the changes that are natural and just determine the changes that
Hello.
Yeah, experimental. So this is the trawl survey.
Hello.
They look at the species of groundfish on the seafloor, and we've conducted 2 years of this work already. This is Pingo He and Chris Roulehan's work. Then, if we advance, another major issue is the lobster fishery. The lobster fishery in southern part of New England has been diminishing, although it's booming up in the Gulf of Maine. We are doing a ventless trap survey, which means that it's the same survey structure as both Rhode Island and Mass DMF conduct, and you basically look at the number of lobster and also buried females, which you see here. At the same time, we conduct larval surveys for ichthyofauna. And on the map, you can see we have a random stratified design in the impact area and the control area, again, under that same framework. So this is tied into those two larger efforts from the states. This is our drop camera survey. We've been doing this with the scallop fishery since 1999. We have information over about 70,000 kilometers squared using this sampling design that was developed here at UMass with the scallop fishery. This gives us, it's a photographic survey, and we identify about 50 different invertebrates and substrat. And again, you can see inside the impact area and the surrounding area. This is linked into samples that we conduct all along the continental shelf. Now, so those are the four main surveys that are being used by vineyard wind, or used with vineyard wind, to trying to determine some of the direct implications of putting hardware in the water and developing this field, which is going to change the benthic structure and the currents to some extent. But to understand further the currents, Dr. Chen and his group here at UMass have this incredibly power FVCOM model, and it tells you the current, the temperature distribution, and we're using this to determine larval distributions for both the scallop fishery and also the ground fishery, and also changes in the oceanographic environment when you put these kind of structures into the water column. And this was funded by the scallop research set aside through the scallop fishing industry, and also BOEM has funded some of this work. Dr. Cadron's work, there's a lot of concern about how the noise and the electromagnetic field will affect fish migrations and spawning distributions. He is looking at tagging acoustically cod, particularly around the Cox's Ledge area, where there is a spawning stock of cod. And this is one of the animals that people are very concerned about with their stock assessment at the moment. However, these receivers will also download any tagged animal. So there's lots of migrational work with tuna and sharks that also use this kind of technology. So that'll benefit all those. And finally, Dr. Gavin Fay's research, he looks at ecosystem-based management, he and his students, and they're really looking at the effects on the community and the broader scale distribution. So you can compare both the fishing industry and also the energy production, and over a series of different categories determine how they measure and compare up to each other. So this is much more of a kind of pulling it into the latest thinking in ecosystem-based management. So I see I've gone over my 8 minutes by a little bit. Thank you for letting me run a minute or so long, and I'll be glad to answer any questions. Just a final note, this is a squid mop, and squid are one of the more difficult species to study, but we were hoping to get some work done on those as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So we're urging folks to hold their questions, but put them in the question and answer feature here. And we are now going to hear from Dr. Copping, and she's ready to go.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much. I apologize to everybody. I have no idea what went on there. Apologize to Kevin. I feel like I was interrupting there too, so sorry. So yes, I'm Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, but I'm also here today with sort of the weight of OES Environmental, Ocean Energy Systems Environmental, made up of 15 nations that who come together to look at environmental effects of marine renewable energy. So this is not something we could do alone. Do I have control of the slides? I don't think I do. Could I have the next slide?
You should have control of them with the cursor.
Really?
My apologies, you have control now.
Okay, thank you. Maybe. Not so much. You can control the screens. Using my keyboard layout. Well, it's not changing. Thank you. So today I want to very briefly just talk about marine renewable energy and offshore wind, benefits and effects. And I want to end with a very short bit about getting us thinking about the carbon footprints of renewables. And then finally, just sort of refer you to some resources I think you'll find helpful. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'm not controlling these. Okay, so marine renewable energy. I think we all know that's the energy harvested from the movement of ocean water, waves, tides, currents, also temperature and salinity gradients. In the US, we include energy generated from large rivers, not hydro, but turbines in rivers as well. This is industries in the early stages of development and commercialization worldwide. Offshore wind, on the other hand, of course, is wind turbines that are either piled into the seabed or on floating platforms. The bottom-mounted offshore wind is very well established in Europe and in Asia, and the new commercial development is just beginning in the US. Floating offshore wind up on platforms like the bottom picture there is still pre-commercial. Next slide, please. So benefits. For both marine renewables and offshore wind, the benefits are pretty similar and very clear. We are looking at mitigation of climate change, even though we cannot say it's a zero carbon industry because of manufacture and so on. It's obviously a very low carbon industry leading to decarbonization and climate change mitigation. Energy security becomes very important, especially in coastal remote areas where you can generate electricity locally rather than having to depend on land-based grids, which could suffer from various kinds of disruptions. And then clearly economic development and jobs, particularly in areas that are not tremendously full of jobs and economic development in coastal areas. And this is why many countries and regions are pursuing these renewables, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it adds to their employment. Next slide, please. But we have to admit there are potential effects on animals and habitats, and I'm going to spend some time talking about that. But also, if we think of offshore wind, which has a substantial surface expression, visual and aesthetic effects. Some people are concerned about noise based on land-based wind. And it's also important to note that when we do development of these kinds of systems in remote areas, there can be tremendous pressure on social systems, schools and roads and social services. So we have to be really thinking about weighing these benefits and effects and really finding ways we can ameliorate the effects. Next slide, please. So I want to dig into environmental effects of marine renewables and offshore wind a little bit. We use the construct of stressors and receptors. It's Bullitt and Gill in 2010 that really sort of popularized this idea. The stressors are those parts of a system, the device, the mooring, other parts that might cause stress, injury, or death to marine animals or habitats. And the key ones we've really boiled it down to are listed here. Collision risk, and in the upper left, collision risk. This is sort of indicating underwater tidal turbine collision, but the same is true for birds and bats with wind turbines. Underwater noise, how does this affect from operation? How does this affect animal communication, navigation? Electromagnetic fields are given off cables carrying power, and some species are sensitive. Changes in habitat. We know that the bottom habitat, if you site it carefully is quite small, the bottom footprint, but we need to be careful where we put these. And of course, there are devices and mooring lines and so on in the water column. Changes in oceanographic systems. If we take energy out, we may change circulation, sediment transport, wave height. Entanglement, particularly as we're thinking about floating offshore wind turbines with long mooring lines. There have been issues raised about entanglement by large animals like whales. Largely not a problem, we believe, because this is really a remnant of the fishing industry lost gear. It's really not that applicable. And finally, displacement, which we really study very little yet, but this is the idea that if you put a lot of devices out in the ocean, you may disturb the migratory patterns or not allow animals to get to their preferred habitats. Next slide, please. So let's talk about, why don't you click through these? Let's talk about what's similar between marine renewables. That's great. Oh, back one. Thank you. What's similar? We have surface expressions in both cases. These are wave devices on the left, and then of course the offshore wind turbines. Installation processes are similar, particularly for floating wind, not quite the same for bottom piled wind. You may have draped cables between devices that could be in the way of things. We also have export cables that will put out some EMF. Next slide, please, and please click through this one too. But what's different? We have wave and tidal devices closer to shore, whereas offshore wind tends to be further out. There tend to be more mooring lines. There's higher capacity energy being moved through these systems, and we may have more mooring lines. The water depth is also usually much greater for wind. So those are some sort of differences in things that may have effects. Next slide, please. I am told I'm running short of time, so we're racing here. So I just want to give a quick little thought about carbon footprints for renewables. These vary tremendously by energy generation source. We usually think in terms of electricity, and we don't have a lot of information for offshore wind or tidal or wave. Just a quick look at the sort of order of magnitude. This is out of the UK Office of Science and Technology, thinking about electricity generation. And we realize that the marine that solar panels, marine, wind, and so on have much smaller carbon footprints. No surprise to anyone, but as we move forward with these offshore renewables, we need to get good solid data to really see where we fall here. Next slide, please. Once again, we have to think in terms of carbon footprints. We have to think about the whole life cycle analysis. It's not just a matter of when you're actually either installing or generating, but what about manufacturing and so on. And on the left, we once again see that things like wave and tidal and offshore wind and so on have very small lifetime carbon footprints. But we don't have very good information. We don't have good ways of doing LCA for these particular technologies. On the right, just to kind of point out that in most cases, and this is actually for wind and solar, it's land-based wind, but I think that the principle holds, the cultivation or fabrication of these and construction are probably the largest impacts, much more so than operation. Next slide. Okay, I just want to kind of leave you with two quick notes of some resources you may find handy. TETHIS is the online knowledge management system developed and maintained by my laboratory, and it has international scope. It's got papers, reports, etc. Many of them you can search either database-wise or geographically through a map viewer. If you're not familiar with TETHIS, please go visit. TETHIS Blast is our every other week newsletter that will bring you up to date on new news and events in the industry, but also around what's new on TETHIS. And this covers both marine energy and wind, offshore and land-based wind. And finally, we have just put out the State of the Science report for, this is under Ocean Energy Systems Environmental. It's a very large report, over 300 pages. You'll be happy to know there's a good executive summary in multiple languages, as well as one-pagers to get you into it. But this, we do believe, as of September 2020, this is the most up-to-date compilation of environmental effects of marine renewables, but it has tremendous sort of holdover to offshore wind as well, although it is pointed at wave and tidal. And that's it. Last slide. I want to thank you very much for allowing me to do this huge quick gallop through this. Love to hear from any questions or any comments you might have, and I do hope you'll go look at some of these resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Copping.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Okay, I think we are going on next to hear from Alan Lowdon, who is the Director of Strategic Development at Bristol Community College's National Offshore Wind Institute.
Hello from the UK.
Welcome.
Welcome. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Andrea. That was extremely interesting. A lot of resonance with what's going on over here as well. Okay, right. Alan Lowdon, Director of Strategic Development, National Offshore Wind Institute. And in the interest of time, can we take the next slide, please? Okay, the presentation, I'm going to give a brief introduction and then talk about some economic impact studies which have been done. Then I'm going to introduce the National Offshore Wind Institute, and I'll give you some summarizing remarks. Next slide, please. Okay, we've heard a lot about this already, but offshore wind clearly is on the rise globally. And the US is entering the industry at a great price point, levelized cost of energy price point. The European supply chains developed at pace over the last 20 years. The UK has got the largest offshore wind market at present, and a lot of that expertise is starting to arrive on US shores, and China is on the rise. Both Massachusetts and Rhode Island still in early March in the US, which is manifest by the Block Island wind farm, which we all know and love. European developers, OEMs, service companies, and academia are all heavily active, and there's lots of knowledge and technology transfer already underway. The US content, of course, any country will be saying this, is of paramount importance, and that's very, very important to sustaining the industry locally. So clean growth, very much on the agenda in Massachusetts, wider New England, job creation, economic development, and importantly, as Andrea's just mentioned, energy security. It depends upon a trained and competent workforce and a means of both generating and commercializing new IP. And the National Offshore Wind Institute at Bristol Community College has been created with all of this in mind. And the presentation highlights the work to date in economic development and also workforce development, the agenda, and the dedicated facility which has been created. Next slide, please. So in terms of economic impact, what I want to do here is just to quote some statistics from the 2018 Mass CEC supported workforce development study. And it was based upon an assumption of 1.6 gigawatts of offshore wind being deployed in Massachusetts and Rhode Island in 400 megawatt tranches constructed every 2 years. And the famous NREL jetty model was used to model both low, medium, and high scenarios. And it came out with some very interesting statistics. So if we look at the capital expenditure, the CapEx, which is the principal component of cost in the construction phase, the modeling actually come up with a range of 2,200, nearly 2,300 jobs, up to 3,000 direct jobs as a consequence of the capital expenditure profiling of this 4x400 megawatt layout every 2 years. So a significant number of jobs there. But if you expand it to job years, which is those who are getting trained in the supply chain in terms of labor, that rose to 6,000, just under 6,900 to nearly 10,000 direct, indirect, and induced job years. So people brought into the sector for either full, part-time, or on a piecemeal basis. In terms of economic output from the activity itself, just under $700 million, rising to potentially on the high-end scenario, 800 million, but with a total impact across the supply chain of a significant figure of 1.4 billion to $2.1 billion. And this doesn't include the repowering spike. If one looks at the end of an asset's life, then it's going to either be decommissioned or it's going to be repowered. And if it's repowered, the construction cycle starts again. Moving on to operations and maintenance, the OPEX, which is principally focused on the operations and maintenance over the lifetime of the asset, typically 20 to 25 years on a normal design cycle. There were on the modeling scenarios, just under 1,000 to 1,800, 1,750 direct, indirect, and induced job years annually. So this is every year over the life cycle of that asset base. And this compounds to around about $200 million to $365 million annually. So this is a serious figure. So it shows you that operations and maintenance has the biggest job potential. It's also got the biggest economic impact, and it's also aligned with local workers. Okay, moving on to the National Offshore Wind Institute. This has been designed with all of the aforementioned in mind. It's been in receipt of significant Mass CEC and Massachusetts government support. It's based at the New Bedford site. The fit out starts in 2021. We've selected a site. It's going to be initially focused on GWO, Global Wind Organization accreditation. We're going to be involved in training the trainer, and we're going to be launching courses during 2021. You will have seen in the press during the summer that an agreement was signed with the world famous Maersk Training. Maersk is one of the preeminent training providers for the offshore wind and offshore industry sector globally. Initial 5-year strategic partnership, and we are going to be bringing to life the Global Wind Organization basic safety training and basic technical training courses initially. Other GWO courses are going to be offered in partnership with Maersk Training as well as the NAUI develops, and this is work in progress. We're also going to be leveraging Bristol Community College's credit and non-credit courses in offshore wind, which is an extremely important angle on this. And this will lead to the 2021 being the startup year for the facility, as I previously mentioned. And in that year, we'll be bringing to life the basic safety and basic technical training work for GWO. At the beginning of the year, we're going to be launching the Women in Offshore Wind program, which is sponsored by Lockheed Martin. And shortly after that, we'll be bringing to life the Bridges into Offshore Wind, which is a professionally developed and focused program of activities for those who want to get into the industry, but also who may want to see things through a slightly different lens. So that's coming online around about March time. And importantly, in 2022, in line with this importance that Alejandro said around the innovation and entrepreneurship agenda, we're going to be adding on to the NAUI, the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Center, which will look at supporting people who want to commercialize new ideas and take them on the commercialization journey from the idea to making money from it. And next slide, please, which is the final slide. So in summary, Massachusetts has been positioning for offshore wind for years. I've personally been involved in a lot of the work down at the Wind Technology Testing Center at Charlestown, and it's had major economic impacts. And these will also continue to flourish as the industry grows within the state and the wider Commonwealth. Massachusetts and Rhode Island in particular start to gain handsomely from offshore wind in the immediate term. We've already looked at the fact that construction phase is outshone by the O&M phase. Job numbers and economic impact on that assessment basis have shown this to be the case. And in general, the gut feel is that this is something which is going to be sustainable. The life cycle of the wind farm is the key factor in terms of sustainable job creation. As soon as an asset is constructed in the ocean, the operations and maintenance phase starts, no matter if you've only got one wind farm operating or one wind turbine operating. Local content must be sustainable, and every country around the world is seeking to get this correct. So Massachusetts is a center of knowledge generation and application. That's been that for centuries. We're looking to create more and better jobs through the NAUI, and we're looking to engage with academia and national labs, Tufts, UMass, and the testing center down at Charleston, as I've already mentioned. And certainly the NAUI will augment the offshore wind asset base in New England significantly. Pan-New England collaboration is already underway. We're having discussions across various states as to how we can work in close collaboration. And certainly Bristol Community College with the NAUI is positioning for lasting impact across the offshore wind knowledge spectrum. It's going to be market focused, relevant, and extremely professional. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. Okay, we are moving on. Our final speaker for this panel is Captain Michael Burns, who is the Director for Maritime and Professional Training at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you everybody for attending today. Again, my name is Mike Burns. I'm the director of the Mass Maritime Academy Center for Maritime and Professional Training. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'll give you a quick introduction about the Academy today. We'll talk about some just general regulations that pertain to the development and safety of offshore wind. I'll talk about some of the land-based regulations, regulations and responsibility at sea, as well as at the wind turbine itself. We'll talk about safety training requirements and how GWO fits into that, and then I will wrap up as well. Next slide, please. So those of you who are not familiar with us, Mass Maritime Academy is one of the 9 public colleges in the Commonwealth. We are a consistently top-rated public school by U.S. News and World Report and Time and Money magazine. We have 7 undergraduate majors and 3 graduate majors, all of which we believe have relevance in the offshore wind industry. And we're very proud to say that we've been training people for careers on the ocean since 1891. For myself, if we go back one, Mass Maritime Academy, the Center for Maritime and Professional Training, where I work, handles all of the professional development training on campus. So I've been asked to talk about some of the regulations regarding this entire industry, and I'm going to give credit to Mr. Dan Hubbard for developing our next slide, which succinctly puts together all of these regulations in a very easy to read format. So as you can see, there's quite a bit to it. So I'm going to ask for the next slide, and I'll break that down into a little bit easier sections. So for on land, in terms of what might be relevant to offshore wind, OSHA is the authority regarding safety regulations, and their regulations fall under 29 CFR. Pertains to health and safety standards, both in shipyards, marine facilities, and safety requirements for longshoremen. Next slide, please. At sea, once we get underway, it's the U.S. Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard, as you can imagine, has responsibility for safety in our ports and waterways, as well as safety of navigation in terms of navigational aids and proper checks of equipment, ensuring that critical pieces of equipment such as life-saving gear and maneuvering gear has type approvals, which allow ensure that it meets the requirements of a marine environment. They also cover maritime security as well as subsea cabling. Next slide, please. Coast Guard also has quite a bit of regulation in 46 CFR, which is more operationally related, and again covers construction requirements for all vessels, not just offshore wind. For example, things like fire resistance of materials, adequate berthing, and firefighting equipment. All of that's covered in the CFRs and is the Coast Guard's area of responsibility. Additionally, credentialing of mariners is one of those responsibilities. For anybody looking to work on a vessel in any industry, not just offshore wind, there are very well-defined training requirements for somebody to become a licensed mariner. And those training requirements ensure, and those credentials ensure, that an individual has the knowledge, understanding, and proficiency to do their job safely and correctly. Okay, at the wind turbine division of the Department of Interior, Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, or BSEE, has their regulations housed in 30 CFR, Section 585, and they're also reserving Section 285 for any future regulations. According to information provided on their website, they state that it's the operator's responsibility to ensure that there's safety on their facilities. They do require safe working conditions. properly operating equipment, hazard management, and careful record keeping. And they do require the operators and developers to demonstrate that they're able to prove that these conditions are met. So while there's no prescribed requirements, such as with the Coast Guard, there is a requirement to demonstrate that your workers are safely trained. And for many of us, that falls under GWO, the Global Wind Organization. Sorry for that. So with regard to industry accepted training standards, the one that is growing consistently is the Global Wind Organization. It's a nonprofit organization which is founded by the offshore wind industry for the offshore wind industry. And they've come up with accepted training standards that can be used throughout the industry and are accepted by anybody who's signatory to GWO. Now, these standards are reviewed regularly and updated with feedback from the field, and those revisions are incorporated into the training programs on a regular basis. And there we go. So at Mass Maritime, we have partnered with Rely on New Tech, which is the largest training provider by volume of GWO training in the world. And in cooperation with them, have developed a GWO basic safety training program, which has been in operation for about a year now. We're currently offering the 5 modules that make up GWO basic safety training, in particular sea survival, and this is the one that's particular to the offshore wind industry. The other 4 modules are working at heights, first aid, manual handling, and fire awareness, all designed to allow workers to mitigate risks and have some of the tools that they might need to remain safe in a very harsh, isolated environment. Next slide. Okay, and so for future opportunities, in addition to the GWO basic safety training, we're happy to announce that we have been awarded a grant by the Mass Clean Energy Center to study the further demands of the industry. In particular, we're going to focus on crew transfer vessel operator training, expanding the GWO suite of courses to possibly include enhanced rescue or enhanced first aid. We'll look at helicopter hoisting to explore the demands and the requirements for that type of program, as well as really any other program that might be necessary based on feedback from the industry to enhance the safety of the offshore workforce. And with that, I will conclude, and I'm happy to answer any questions we might have at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. All right. So again, for folks who have questions, if they would like to post those questions in the Q&A, that would be super. We do have a couple of questions that one of them has been already answered, but I am going to read the question. And this is from Peter McCarthy. And the question is, how many of the quote created jobs end quote projected are actually expected to be in New England? And Alan Lowdon responded to that. The figures cited were for Massachusetts and Rhode Island on the basis of the 1.6 gigawatt deployment assumption over 8 years. And I think if you would like more information on that, you can certainly dive into the 2018 Massachusetts Clean Energy Center Workforce Report. Let's see, the next question is, this question is from Alf Carroll and it's directed to Kevin. Can you talk about the impact assessments for marine mammals like whales for marine renewable energy or offshore wind?
All right, well, thank you for the question. I can't talk specifically on the marine mammal surveys because I've not been involved with them, but I know that a number of them are underway. Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, Mass CEC, if you go on their website, they've had 3 years of surveys. They're doing aerial surveys, and I think a lot of that is in collaboration with the New England Aquarium. That's where a lot of the whale work is coming out. And I believe that Vineyard Wind is also involved in that and working with them. So I know there are surveys underway. I think a lot of them are aerial. Also in a recent presentation for ROSA, which is the Regional Science Association, they're talking about both passive and active acoustics and lining acoustic monitoring on these platforms to also try and help with whale and other sea mammals. So I'm sorry, I can't be a little more specific on that. It's a little out of my area, but I do know that those studies are underway.
Could I add a little bit to that, Megan?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so certainly studies in Europe and elsewhere, and what's going on in the east coast of the U.S. with the bottom piled wind. The bigger concerns, of course, are the installation, the acoustics, and additional vessel traffic from pounding piles into the seabed. When you start to look at the floating wind, as we are on the west coast and also the Gulf of Maine, and in deeper water, concerns have been raised about these mooring lines, and I alluded to them really quickly. One of my postdocs and I put together an animation, but with real data, of humpbacks swimming through a farm, an offshore wind farm with the mooring lines. And what it really comes down to is scale. These are really deep and really big lines, and whales don't look that big. So I would refer you to Tethys to look for that. There's a report and then this animation, because we found BOEM on the West Coast was getting a lot of questions. And it's a really interesting question. I think we put that to bed a little bit, but there are concerns about marine debris, particularly abandoned fishing gear ending up on lines, and could this cause some kind of danger to probably not large whales, but smaller cetaceans, sea turtles, etc. So there is some active research in the area, but there's not an awful lot, frankly.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? All right, well, I think that does it for us on this panel.